Well, welcome everyone. I'm Bruce Ball. I'm VP of Tax for CPA Canada, and we're pleased to present a new webinar with the CRA on the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy. In today's webinar, we'll provide an overview of the new program and demonstrate the online subsidy tools and the application portal. Another thing we've done, we had opened up Slido to take in questions on the CERS program. And in today's session, we're going to look at some of the questions. We weren't able to deal with all of them, but we'll look at what appeared to be the top questions that we had come in, both from Slido. We had some other feedback as well, so we've provided a mix of that to the CRA. But we will be tracking all of the things that we received, and we will be looking for ways to get out more information as we move forward into the program. So joining us from the CRA and the Minister of Revenue's office is Matthew Gray. He's a policy advisor in the Office of the Minister of National Revenue. We have Harry Gill, Director General, Small and Medium Enterprises Directorate. Randy Hewlett, who's Director General of the Legislative Policy Directorate. We have Mark Mayer, a manager in the Authorization, Strategy and Operations section. Kevin McKenzie, who's a Director General in the Business Compliance Directorate. And Denise Eisner, who's a Senior Content Strategist in the Digital Design and Production Directorate. So we have a fairly packed agenda, so I think we'll just get right into it. So I'm going to turn it over to Matthew Gray for some opening remarks from the Minister's office.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Gray, Policy Advisor to the Minister of National Revenue. On behalf of the Honourable Diane Leboutillier, I'd like to thank you for joining this webinar and for engaging on the new Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy. I'd especially like to thank CPA Canada for pulling this event together and for promoting access to this program amongst its membership. We are all still hard at work fighting the pandemic together. We're all facing a dark winter and a long road to economic recovery. We know that you have faced the challenge of adapting to changing circumstances, finding new ways of operating while protecting the health and safety of your employees and customers. But the spring will come sooner than we think, and we will continue to support you through this difficult time. This program is the 7th to be implemented by the CRA as a part of the government's economic response plan to the effects of the pandemic. I know that many of you have been waiting for the new version of this program for a few months, and I can assure you that the agency has worked very hard to get it to you as soon as possible. We've worked closely with the Department of Finance and with the help of colleagues across government to make the CERS an even better version than the previous one. We know that you're counting on the CERS, and so are your clients. We know that you're counting on it to be easy to access, to give you certainty and stability. The agency is working hard to get you the information and support necessary so that you can take advantage of it. I hope that you'll find the information on the webinar useful. Lastly, I want to reiterate the importance that we place on working with stakeholders in rolling out these programs. As you know, we listen to stakeholder feedback and change the criteria to include rent payable as an eligible expense. On behalf, again, of the Honourable Diane Leboutillier, I thank you again for your collaboration and participation. Stay safe out there and be well. Back to you, Bruce.
Thanks, Matthew. And it has been great working with both the Minister's office and the CRA on all the issues this year. So I'd encourage people, if you do see issues, do pass them on to us, and we'll definitely be talking to the CRA. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Harry Gill to do an introduction and just some opening remarks from a compliance programs branch perspective on the new subsidy.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruce. So my name is Harry Gill, Director General of the Small and Medium Enterprises Directorate in the Compliance Programs Branch. On behalf of the agency, on behalf of Ted Gallivan, my Assistant Commissioner, I'd like to thank CPA Canada for hosting us today to provide an overview of the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the CRA and CPA Canada have been working together on the rapid deployment of critical social and business support programs. The input and feedback received was instrumental in the design and the ongoing administration of these programs. Maintaining this strong and transparent relationship will continue to play an important role as we resume business operations. We're pleased to provide you with information today about the Emergency Rent Subsidy, or CERS, as most people refer to it. The Government of Canada has created the CERS to provide direct and easy to access rent and mortgage support directly to qualifying organizations. The program was launched on November 23rd, and there are a number of resources available online to assist organizations in preparing their applications, including information about who can apply, eligible expenses, as well as a calculator to help you to determine how much your rent subsidy may be. I would also like to remind everyone that the key objective of the measures put into place by the federal government to respond to the pandemic is to reflect the immediate needs of Canadians and to support the post-crisis economic recovery. As such, there may be updates to the measures after this session is held, and any potential changes may affect the accuracy of the information shared during this session. The questions gathered during sessions such as today's will be considered by CRA in its ongoing communications efforts. These visit CRA's CERS web pages for the most up-to-date information. So now I'd like to pass it on to my colleague, Randy Hewlett.
Thank you, Harry. Hi, folks. Happy to be with you today. I'm Randy Hewlett, Director General of the Legislative Policy Directorate at the Canada Revenue Agency. We are proud to administer the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy on behalf of the Government of Canada. As with the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, a wide range of organizations are eligible to apply for the rent subsidy. These include sole proprietorships and taxable corporations, certain Indigenous government-owned corporations, nonprofit organizations, partnerships consisting of 50% or more qualifying organizations, and registered charities. The rent subsidy has two elements. The first is a base subsidy of up to 65% of eligible expenses for all qualifying organizations that are experiencing a decline in revenues. The base subsidy rate varies depending on the organization's revenue decline and applies to a maximum of $75,000 in eligible expenses per location and an overall maximum of $300,000 in eligible expenses for an organization and any affiliated entities per claim period. Eligible expenses include commercial rent, property taxes, including school taxes and municipal taxes if these are part of your property tax assessment, property insurance, and interest on commercial mortgages subject to limits for a qualifying property, less any subleasing revenues. Any sales tax component of these costs is not an eligible expense. The second element of the rent subsidy is lockdown support, an additional top-up of 25% of eligible expenses for organizations that are under a lockdown or have significantly limited activities due to a public health order. The lockdown support rate applies to a maximum of $75,000 in eligible expenses per location and is prorated based on the number of days in a claim period that the lockdown was in effect. Locations must have been under lockdown for 7 or more days during the period, and there is no cap on the number of locations affected that can be claimed under lockdown support for a period. Eligible organizations must qualify for a base subsidy in order to qualify for lockdown support. The government has proposed an amendment to the rent subsidy that would allow applicants to include eligible expenses in their application before the expense has been paid. The CRA will administer the rent subsidy on the basis of this proposed amendment. This means that qualifying organizations can include rent and other eligible amounts that are payable for the claim period in their rent subsidy application, even though they have not paid the amount yet. However, organizations must pay the amount owing within 60 days of the payment to them of the related rent subsidy amount. Organizations will be required to attest that they will meet this condition as part of their rent subsidy application. The rent subsidy is currently in place from September 27, 2020 until December of 2021. The government has proposed to extend the current subsidy rates for an additional 3 periods. This means a base subsidy rate of up to 65% and the rate of 25% for lockdown support for an additional 3 periods until March 13th, 2021. Thank you. Mark Mayer, over to you.
Thank you, Randy, and good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Mayer, and I'm a manager for the Authorization Strategy and Operations section in the Assessment, Benefit, and Service branch of the CRA. Qualifying organizations can apply retroactively for the rent subsidy's first eligibility period, which began on September 27th and ended on October 24th. Organizations can apply through the CRA's My Business Account portal, or their representatives, including their employees, can apply through the CRA's Represent a Client portal. Applications for the second eligibility period, that is from October 25th to November 21st, opened on November 30th. We appreciate how important the rent subsidy is to eligible organizations, and we're making it a priority to deliver subsidy payments as quickly as possible. The CRA has rent subsidy web pages and a calculator to support applicants. The rent subsidy web pages include detailed information and instructions about who can apply, how the claim periods are structured, and the types of expenses that can be claimed. The rent subsidy calculator guides applicants through a step-by-step process that will show them the maximum support they qualify for based on the information that they provide before they even apply. The calculator also includes a printable statement feature that applicants can use to enter required information into the application form, enabling organizations to submit their claims quickly and easily. We have purposely designed the rent subsidy online content and application process to mirror the wage subsidy, and those that have benefited from the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy should find this process very familiar. I'd like to add that in developing the rent subsidy web pages and calculator, the CRA again received input and feedback from many stakeholders, including the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, and Restaurants Canada. We appreciate the important role that stakeholders are playing in providing feedback about how the rent subsidy program will operate. As we collect applications, we will refine our automated verification process based on the information we gather. My colleague will speak more about our verification process in just a few moments. Applicants are encouraged to take time to visit the rent subsidy web pages, learn more about the program, calculate the subsidy in advance, and then apply at the time that's convenient for them. That's all for me. I'd like to thank you very much once again for being here this morning, and I will pass it over to you, Kevin McKenzie.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm Kevin McKenzie. I'm the Director General of the Business Compliance Directorate in the Collections Verification Branch, and I'll just take a few minutes to outline how the verification process works. So the CRA started processing applications on November 30, and we're using a automated verification system. Once processed through our automated verification system, we would expect payments to be issued within 3 to 8 days. We would encourage, of course, applicants to register for direct deposit, as this will enable them to receive their payments more quickly. As my colleagues have said, we're making it a priority to deliver the rent subsidy payments quickly, but at the same time, we need to maintain a balance between making emergency funds accessible and maintaining the program's integrity by verifying that applicants are entitled to receive the subsidy amounts they're claiming. So, as I said, to this end, we're going to verify claims using a combination of automated validation, drawing on our existing data, and in some cases, follow-up phone calls to verify certain elements of a claim before we issue a payment. We know that there will be situations where the CRA does not have the information about a claimant on file, or where we do not have enough information to verify the details of the claim. So in these situations, we'll contact applicants to request additional information, such as maybe lease agreements or rental agreements. And we may also contact third parties to validate information provided by applicants. Certainly, if you're contacted to validate information in your application, we would encourage you to provide this as quickly as possible, because this will allow us to expedite the processing of applications. So with that, I will give the floor back to our moderator, Bruce Ball. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. So the next part, we're going to turn it over to Denise to do a walkthrough of the calculator, which you can use, as we just discussed, to calculate the amount of the subsidy. So Denise, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for me to join this session and share with you the design of the emergency rent subsidy calculator. As my colleagues at the CRA have pointed out, it offers you the opportunity to go in and do a calculation of the rent subsidy amount before you do your application. So I want to highlight some of the features of the product design. As the product manager and content strategist, I led a team that worked very, very quickly within about 35 days from the moment we received the legislation to when we could launch. Working with some of the key lessons that we learned through development of the wage subsidy calculator. So if you've used that product, you're going to see a lot of similarities with the rent subsidy. I want to point out some of the key sections page by page. Again, this might feel familiar to you if you have used the wage subsidy. It's the same layout. We first go into a discussion of what are the requirements for eligibility and for eligible expenses. And we invite you to spend some time with these pages. There's quite a bit of detail here, but we tried to make it as simple and as straightforward as possible, starting with who can apply with the eligibility criteria. Then the periods you can apply for, which as you can see now, you see 2 claim periods, and of course that will adjust as we go into each new claim period. Then the expenses you can claim, both for qualifying property and eligible expenses. Again, lots of good detail here. We've integrated all the information for all of our audiences within these sections so that your needs for understanding some of the details around the policy and how the legislation works out in the product is right here for you at the page level. You don't have to go somewhere else to get it. It's right here. We've embedded everything into each section of the product, hopefully making this a better user experience for everybody. Calculating your subsidy amount, of course, is the real subject. And here we have, again, offered a bit of the behind-the-scenes information on how the subsidy is calculated. We know that this is important information, particularly for this audience, to understand some of the sort of the calculations around this. And we've provided these details at the point of need, depending on what it is you'd be interested in learning more about. And I think this will be really helpful too. It doesn't mean you have to go off to another page. Everything is right here at the ready. The next part, again, you may see this as a familiar feature, the checklist. What we're finding is that for those that are particularly new to some of the products, this is a helpful way for them to make sure that they're ready with their numbers before they start the calculation. And they offers them links to additional information if they feel they don't have a full grasp of that particular topic. And where we can, we also provide those details right here so you don't have to jump from the page. One thing to note when using the calculators, we're not saving any information. So if we send you off to another page, that's probably because it's a more involved topic and does require a little more review before you proceed with the calculator itself. Now we get to the calculator through some fairly straightforward steps. One being, of course, is picking the period that you are claiming for. In this case, we're going to select period 1. Your second step, determine if you have those affiliated entities. If you're not sure exactly what falls in the definition, we offer it here. Again, you don't have to leave the page and you can decide yes or no, whether or not that applies for your particular situation. Calculating your rent subsidy rate is really when we start to get into applying some of the numbers for the particular business. And you have 2 options for this. You can either compare 2019 or the average of January and February 2020, whichever works best for your particular situation. For here, we're going to do the comparison with 2019, and for the purposes of the demo, keep it fairly simple in terms of numbers. And as I enter, you can see in the gray box that it starts to already populate with an answer. Again, deliberate design here. We're trying to make this pretty straightforward. Here you can see by this revenue drop that the rent subsidy rate is 65%, the maximum amount. And it allows you to also make adjustments if you felt you made an error in some of your entries. And you can re-update, or you can update your revenue drop. The next section is very important in terms of figuring out the top-up amount, or the lockdown support as we call it, where you enter your business locations. Here you would enter one by one location information. Again, this is for your records, so you can enter whatever you like, but we've offered sort of the choices of address information is making this fairly clear as to which location you're talking about. You then need to figure out, does the location qualify for support? As my colleagues have pointed out, there's quite a bit here in terms of the lockdown criteria. And again, we offer it right here on the page. So if you're not sure and you want to check a couple facts, you can do so here very quickly. If you don't need that, then you would click, yes, I do want to put in the lockdown support for this particular location. You'll notice that we've already pre-populated the calendar dates with the actual dates for the claim period. And again, that's to hopefully make it easier for you. This presumes, of course, that that location was closed due to a public health restriction for the full period. If not, you would have to adjust one of these dates. As you can see here, we default to the full period, therefore the 28 days, showing a lockdown support rate of 25%. If we were to adjust those days downward, that rate would change. The next choice you would make is whether or not, if for this particular location, if it's a rent or own situation. For rent, we have heard from our stakeholder feedback that although the claim periods work on the 28-day cycles, it doesn't necessarily map to the way in which rent is paid, which is usually on a monthly basis. So we offer you that opportunity to select monthly, and we do the math for you behind the scenes. So if you were to enter your monthly rents for September and October, which are the 2 months straddling this particular claim period, you would see that we will do the calculation for you. And as I go down below with the summary box, you can see that this amount reflects the fact that it's 28 days between those 2 months, and we already have calculated the correct amount for the lockdown. If you're in an own situation, as my colleagues pointed out, you will have different eligible expenses that you would need to enter. Again, trying to make this easier for people putting this in, we've allowed you to select the time frame that makes the most sense based on your data. So you can select per month, year, or the actual claim period dates and select your amounts. So we'll go back to rent. We still have those in memory. And now we can sort of see that we can add more locations as needed. So as many as you want. And when you're finished, we offer you 2 ways of saving your information. One is a location summary, which allows you to, again, print the summary or save it to a PDF. It'll show you each location, the qualifying expenses, and then the calculated basic CSRS amount as well. Now we're ready to get results. This final panel, which you can also print and save, first shows you the line amounts that you will see on the application form. We found that this is an incredibly useful way for people to transcribe the numbers from the calculator over into the application form. Each one will have the very specific line number and the description, hopefully making that task really easy. And then your amounts. So for the $5,500 rent expense that I enter for this particular location, you can see the total Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy here, along with including the base subsidy rate of 65% and with the amount. Going back up to the rest of the product, again, you will find some of this very familiar into the how to apply section is very similar to the wage subsidy with the specific steps you have to do, including applying for the CSRS either through your My Business account or registered to represent a client account. You will have to create a CSRS number, and we give you some information on how you can move forward if you do have that number or if you do not, and how you would get that number. Also information about setting up direct deposit. And this section also very important about the kind of information you want to have on hand when you're doing your application form and you're applying for a specific period. So some details here about information that you want to have in your records. We also give you some details on how to fill out the application form. right here in the product, in case you need those details. What happens after you apply in terms of when and how we send payment. And also if there are any other questions about how you contact us for CERS. So that concludes the demo, and I'll pass this now back to our moderator, Bruce Ball.
Well, thanks, Denise. It's a really impressive site with all the calculations, and we were happy to have a look at it, and it looks like some enhancements have been made since then as well. So I hope that everyone will find that really helpful in terms of doing the calculations and getting ready to make a claim. So next on our agenda, we're going to do the questions that have come into us. So I think it's mainly me and Randy, but we'll see as we go. So I'm going to, I guess, ask the questions, and then we'll turn it over to CRA to walk us through the discussion on them. So the first one by far is probably what we're hearing the most. I'm sure not a surprise to the people out there, but I found in my, previously in my professional life that having real estate that was owned in one company and operating a business in another company is a very common situation. So we've definitely had questions roll in on that, and I think there might be some confusion as well, because if you are talking about a situation where you have an OpCo and a realty co, which is sort of the situation we put the CRA. There is rent, but it's actually not going to be what you're claiming. It's you have to do it a bit differently. So our first question was pretty broad, actually. Can you highlight the key considerations that need to be considered in a situation like this when you say have the typical two-company arrangement with the real estate in one company?
Thank you for the question, Bruce. So the issue that arises, of course, when you have this non-arm's length relationship between the holdco and the opco, is that, and the opco pays rent to the holdco, is that the expenses paid by opco that are paid to a non-arm's length party are not eligible for the rent subsidy. That doesn't mean, however, that holdco cannot in and of itself apply for the rent subsidy. In such a case where it's only has rent to receive from the opco, it can avail of certain elections under the legislation to consolidate the revenue and apply for the rent subsidy itself in respect of the expenses that it has related to ownership, notably property tax, insurance, and perhaps interest on a commercial mortgage. So that would be my basic recommendation as to how someone in that situation should look to avail to the maximum extent possible of the rent subsidy.
So maybe as a follow-up, if that's okay, Randy, is
Sure.
the election under paragraph 125.74D available, where you can sort of look to the other corporation's revenue and do it that way, or does it? Because there's a couple of ways to consolidate, I guess.
Yes, so there's two elections that are possibly available. They'd have to determine, of course, given that the holdco receives all or substantially all of its revenue from the opco, you have the election under 125.74B that could be there as well. Corporations are likely affiliated. They may be able to avail of the election under 125.74D, which allows for consolidation. This presumes, of course, they don't already consolidate their revenue.
Yeah, because that's an important consideration, because the election that you might have already made under B to consolidate, that'll apply for the rent subsidy as well.
Yeah, that's a very important, and that's actually one of the first questions you have on your other list. And maybe we can cover it now, given we're talking about it. Is while those elections you can change them from period to period, the wage subsidy and the rent subsidy are calculated off the same way, and that is to say they have to use the same baseline revenue, the same qualifying revenue, and then of course determining what your revenue decrease would be on the basis of elections you might make. And you have to be consistent in the elections that you make for the wage subsidy with the rent subsidy.
Okay. And the one last thing we had in that bit of an outline that we gave you, how does the lockdown, so there's a lockdown order, how does that work when you've got the real estate split out?
Now that's a very interesting question, and my view is that if you're in the situation where the OpCo, if it was eligible for the rent subsidy, might be eligible for the lockdown support, and now you're dealing with a situation where the entity that's claiming the base subsidy is the HoldCo because OpCo is not eligible. I don't see how the HoldCo could be eligible for the lockdown support, given that its business model and its business is not shut down because of the lockdown. So there might be only eligibility for the base subsidy in that particular case.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, at least not fully ineligible.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be honest with everyone. We had a list of issues and we're still sorting out whether it's a Department of Finance thing to maybe consider or something CRA can deal with. And this was one of the ones we weren't too sure about. So I think that's good feedback that we'll be passing this one along to finance as well, just to see what happens here.
Yeah, and Bruce, in a number of our stakeholder engagements that we've had already, the OpCo, HoldCo rental situation is the most common question that we've received. I would say yesterday we had a session and we had about 400 questions. I would suggest to you that more than 20% of those related to that type of scenario.
Well, it makes sense. It's it's very common. It's almost basic, to keep your valuable assets away from business risk. So it is very common. So we'll follow up with finance on that last point about the lockdown. So we did have a separate question on affiliated entities, and as Randy confirmed that if you have made the election under 125.74B, that does apply for the rent subsidy as well. So I guess the question was, do you have to make an additional election? And Randy, I assume the answer is no.
Yeah, so it would be well, you have two separate applications, obviously, that you're filing, one for the rent subsidy and one for the CERS. What I'm saying is that you have to be consistent in the election. They both have to be the same. So I guess for all intents and purposes, it is one election that applies to both subsidies.
So the next question is an interesting one. It talks about, because in a lot of the lockdown situations, the government's been talking about trying to see if you can, continue on doing online sales and that sort of thing. So our next question actually related to that. So to qualify for the lockdown support for a particular location, the ceased activities must account for at least approximately 25% of the total revenues at that location during the prior reference period. So the question is, how does the calculation of the 25% of total revenues at that location, how is that determined for a lockdown location if the business has several locations that are locked down, but also maintain sales through online activities? And I assume the underlying assumption is the online activities are going to increase probably because of the lockdowns.
Yeah, so this is a bit more of a difficult question to give a precise answer on, but let me just leave you with a few thoughts. So first, I would say the business will need to make its best efforts to determine the relevant revenue attached to that location. And I think it's important to note that the legislation indicates that it's reasonable to conclude. It is possible, and so it is possible that the online sales do not relate to any location. I think that would be the rarer case, but it is possible. For example, they use a fulfillment warehouse, but in most cases, those sales I would think would be attached to a location, which could be a warehouse or a sales center rather than a retail location. So really going to be a factual determination in the end, where the expectation is that reasonable efforts will be made to arrive at the allocation of the revenue to a particular location.
Okay. Well, thanks, Randy. Next question. Will the CRA provide a prescribed form for the percentage allocation agreement for affiliated entities? And if not, I guess, can you provide some guidance on what information should be part of that agreement?
So no plans to provide for a separate form for such an agreement. Our view is that the application form page that contains the affiliated entities information is itself the prescribed form.
So I guess carrying on with the same rule. So let's assume that after an application is made, it's found that two entities are affiliated, and maybe this just hasn't been considered properly, or they became aware of how the rule worked. But let's assume that an application is made, and then it's found that two entities are affiliated, but no allocation of the 300,000 has been made. The question, I guess, is how do you correct it, or is there going to be any relief to fix it sort of once you realize there's a problem?
So on a pure technical reading of the legislation, it indicates that in such a scenario, assuming both entities filed a rent subsidy claim, the allocated amount to each entity is nil if they don't do the allocation, which means that the CERS base amount would be zero for both entities. That being said, the entities can file an amended claim to ensure that they get the allocation correct, so as not to adversely affect their rent subsidy claim.
Okay, great. So next question, can you provide guidance on what would be considered operating expenses for the CERS? For example, I guess the things we were wondering about were things like hydro, water, gas, waste or snow removal, building maintenance, that sort of thing.
So this is it's a bit of a tough one to give you a lot of precision on, and it has come up a lot in our previous stakeholder calls. So the important thing to remember is that if you're the owner of the property and you're eligible for CERS, operating expenses doesn't enter into the calculation. It's mostly your property tax, your insurance on the property, and your rent on a commercial mortgage. If you are just merely renting a property as well, your operating expenses do not factor into the calculation. Operating expenses are relevant when you're under what is called a net lease. And you have to, include those. So the important thing to remember is that its amounts need to be required to be paid under the net lease, and it also includes regular installments customarily charged to the lessee. And I believe Denise, when she was going through the calculator page, she had indicated there where you could check on the types of expenses that could qualify. And we indicate there in terms of eligible expenses that you can claim if you're under a net lease. They include the base rent, regular payments for customary operating expenses, property insurance, utilities, common area expenses. So it really, again, it's going to be a fact-driven exercise as to whether or not a particular expense would be considered a utility expense for the purposes of the rent subsidy. But if you're in a net lease situation and the lease specifically requires you to pay those types of expenses, I think in and of themselves, they could be considered utilities. And I would think about your basic hydro, water, and gas. I'm not sure about snow removal and building maintenance being considered a utility, but you'd really have to look at the net lease arrangement to determine whether or not they would be considered net lease type of expenses. Because really what you're trying to do is, when you're in a net lease situation, your base rent is much lower than what your rent would otherwise be, because the owner is shifting certain types of expenses onto you. So that is sort of the policy behind it. So if you are in a net lease situation, I would think that most of those expenses that are listed there could possibly qualify. But again, I can't say for certain. I need to see the actual lease arrangement.
Okay, thanks. Actually, the next question, I think you sort of alluded to part of it, but maybe we can, we'll just ask it from a bit different of a perspective. So now we're talking about utilities, so we'll assume the parts that you just talked about, and the expense could qualify, I suppose. So the question was, and this would be an arm's length lease. So is there a difference on how it would apply if the expenses are paid by the tenant to the landlord on top of rent, or paid by the tenant directly to the service provider? How would that impact the situation if we're talking about arm's length rent?
So I think it's going to depend on the lease agreement. First, is it a net lease? If so, are the amounts required to be paid under the lease agreement? And if so, are the amounts regular installments customarily charged to the lessee under the net lease? I don't think it really matters if they're paid directly to the landlord or directly to the service provider.
Okay. We also had a question on the expenses payable change that's been proposed, and it was regarding property taxes. So the question was for, say, 2021, and the question was, these amounts, I guess, typically don't become payable till mid-year, or depending on how assessments are issued and that sort of thing. Just wondering how the proposed rule would work for something like that, for property tax?
Yeah, so property tax can only be claimed, as you noted, if it's paid or payable. So you need to determine when the property tax amount becomes due, which would depend, on the actual terms of the property tax bill. So that new deeming rule, it deems the amount to be paid when it becomes due, so that it can be included in the claim. So before including property tax amount in the claim, it must be either paid or the amount must have become due. And the same applies to other expenses. You could be in a situation that you can't claim the property tax, on a particular claim period because of the way the property tax assessment and when the amount becomes due is actually determined. It might be a situation you could have to amend your claim.
Okay. And the last question we had was, is the CERS included in revenue for the purposes of determining eligibility under the wage subsidy, the CEWS?
No, it's excluded. We would consider, extraordinary type of situation such that the CERS would be an extraordinary revenue amount that could be excluded.
Okay, great. Well, we've come to the end of this session. I wanted to, again, thank everyone from CRA. It's been great working with you. We've appreciated the interaction throughout the year as the year is drawing to a close. It certainly has been a very difficult year, that's for sure. As you can see, we're working through some issues real time. So we are also, going to be in contact with the Department of Finance as well on whether we see any issues such as the one we talked about with the lockdown in 2 companies. So again, we'll be continuing to follow these issues and providing updates on our website and the COVID update page. So the other thing I'd mention is we did get issues that we weren't able to discuss, so we will be following through on them as well. So again, thanks to everyone from CRA, and thanks for tuning in as well, and all the best for the holidays, and certainly everyone stay well. And I'm sure we'll be back in the new year with more updates.